Hello guys, it's the Craven Bookworm, and today I'd like to give you a book review for Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Frankenstein is a book written by the author Mary Shelley and published in 1818. And it's basically a book about this genius doctor, Dr. Frankenstein, that is slowly trying to uncover the secrets of life, and in his obsessions, tends to create life of his own, aka the monster of Frankenstein. You might have heard and seen the stories in various contexts, as it is often rehashed in a lot of popular movies, and especially after having been taken, after the rights have been given to Universal Studios, they've made quite a profit off of the concept of Frankenstein's monster and made several movies, remakes, and even some remakes that are not quite asked and not that well received either. There were always some aspects which I really enjoyed about the story of Frankenstein, but I thought that the movies really didn't do any justice, as the movies often wanted to like capitalize on the whole aspect of horror or like action or something without actually delving into what I thought made the story of Frankenstein more fascinating. I'm happy to say that the book actually dives into those aspects which I found relatively interesting about Frankenstein and explored those quite a bit more thoroughly. Now, before diving into the proper reviews with pros and cons, I'd like to say that if you're enjoying my channel content, please remember to click the subscribe button and the bell notification so that you can be notified whenever some new bookish content pops up from my channel, or a science content or anything of the like. Any type of support that you can provide will greatly benefit me for my future endeavors. So with that out of the way, let's start diving into the actual review with, first of all, the pros. My first pro with the book is something that I wouldn't thought to be mentioning about a book of this sort and in this review, and that is the actual lifestyle of Victor Frankenstein. And what I mean by this is, especially in the beginning portion of the book, when he starts to tell his story, you start to see basically how he goes from being this very ambitious teenager to like a young adolescent and like a young adult that is very much fascinated by science basically, and he goes to study abroad to like find opportunities and such. And although I will talk a little bit more about his obsession with studying science and such, what I found particularly fascinating about this is it shows basically, at least in the beginning portion of the book, the lifestyle of a student that wants to go and do something like this. A student that wants to advance his or her studies and has to actually go away from home to do this, because it is not often a very easy decision, and it is something that not quite a lot of novels have tackled, because a lot of novels either like to focus already on the portion at which the student is already like in college or university, or just when they're in high school and planning on taking this big jump. But not a lot of stories tend to try to find the bridge between that high school portion, like that end of a coming of an age story, to like this more university and college type of experience. And I thought that the beginning portions of Frankenstein did this beautifully, and it's a nice story basically in the beginning about a student going abroad to study. It's something which I didn't expect to be so taken aback from by this book, but I found it quite impressive. Second major pro I have with the book is the whole discussion about nature versus nurture. Now, before diving into this, one major plot element which you of course know about this book, as I just said it a couple of minutes ago, is the fact that Victor Frankenstein creates a living being, this Frankenstein's monster. And Frankenstein's monster, like despite like popular media portrayals, he is actually a very cognizant being. Like he's very aware, and he comes into this world and starts to wonder what is right, what is wrong, how is he supposed to survive, why don't people like him when he tries to go and interact with people. And contemplating all of these things, and the backbone for this whole theme within the book is the topic of nature versus nurture. In essence, it's talking about whether something is evil or malevolent from its being born, or it gets morphed into being malevolent or evil. Because Victor Frankenstein, the moment like he creates his monster, starts having doubts already about him and starts to think that, hey, what have I done? Like, I've created this monster. While there's nothing even justifying that thought pattern, but And Frankenstein's monster, of course, is just very naive and innocent. But as things continue to happen through the book, you start noticing that it becomes a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that the monster starts morphing into that image which people start to see of him. So it's a very interesting character study. And again, this story of Frankenstein is so much of a detour from what you'd imagine going into Frankenstein, like with like the typical stories that you hear oftentimes. Like the way I think about this whole nature versus nurture type of character study is, if you've seen the Ridley Scott movie Prometheus, which is like a prequel to the Alien movies, the classic Alien movies by Ridley Scott. In Prometheus, there is this character of David that is an android and is questioning like his creators and such. That is more aligned with Frankenstein than anything else, I'd say. And it's very ironic as well, as I think the title of Frankenstein is like the modern day Prometheus. So take from that what you will. And if you know your Greek mythology, you know where that comes from as well. So that's an interesting tidbit of a fun note for you as well. Last but not least, my third brick pro with this book is, of course, the theme of the book, the environment, the atmosphere. It has a very Gothic atmosphere. And not just that, it's a book about science and also epistemological obsession. Like, basically, Victor Frankenstein is this character that becomes like very obsessed with knowing the truth about nature, figuring out the secrets of the universe, basically through science, or what was known back then as natural philosophy. And I found this to be very fascinating, as it shows kind of like how far are you willing to go to try to pursue knowledge. And it's interesting as well, as this book was published in 1818, in the early 19th century, and something known as galvanism was a very steadily rising movement, you could say, or a very steadily rising idea in the 19th century. This was basically a concept that was brought forward by the scientist Volta, which, if you might hear it in the name, it has the name Volt in it. And it's basically the scientist that pioneered a lot of major discoveries in electricity and even in electrophysiology. One of the experiments which derived from this galvanistic philosophy, you could say, is the experiment which, if you have, like, say, the cadaver of a frog, and if you put in some electrically conducting metal to it, or to a particular portion of it, say its spine, then its muscles will contract and you can seemingly reanimate that organism. And this was clearly an inspiration for Mary Shelley. Perhaps you might have seen a demonstration of this somewhere, to write her book, because that was a very scary concept back then, that hey, you might be able to bring that things back to life through electricity. And the whole industrial age in England was filled with revolutions around electricity. So it's very fascinating to see how trends that were current back then heavily influenced Mary Shelley's writing, and how she described this character of Victor Frankenstein, like the creator of the monster, to be someone that was also obsessed with learning about natural philosophy and even the occult, by reading things such as John Dee, which was a very famous occultist back in the, I think, 17th century. So it's just a very fascinating tale about someone who's obsessed with knowledge, and by the end really regrets like having gone far off the deep end, but in his pursuit of knowledge, basically. Now, that was as far as my major praises for the book, but of course there are some small cons which I have with the book, nothing too major. But one of the cons which I have with the book is something which I would have liked personally if Mary Shelley had done this in the book. And that is basically if she showed more of the characters outside of the narrator's perspective. I mean, the writing style of the book is to show you everything from a particular sets of points of view, and this was, of course, intentional, as it gets you thinking and such. But what I personally would have liked is for this to have been like a more general third person type of narrative, in which you could see other people reacting to, like, say, Frankenstein's sometimes deliriums as well, and sometimes his mental like crash downs and such, about being very paranoid and afraid of this monster catching up to him or doing something very terrible. And you do get some taste of this in the book. Like, you do see it. It's not like it's not there. But the reason why I mentioned this is it would have been nice if more people were starting to question the validity of this story, basically, because it would have created doubt within the reader, him or herself. Like, it would have made you think, how much of what Frankenstein is saying is actually true. Like, how much of this is just being made up by Frankenstein, because you never know, like, when someone's in a state of panic and such, how many things he or she could have exaggerated. So having that narrative, I think, would have made it even more fascinating, and it would have made you question some of the claims within the book, and would have made it even more realistic in that sense. But that was, of course, if Mary Shelley was planning on going for like a more psychological, like realistic type of thing, which I think was less of the case, and I think it was more of so delving into the poetry of a man obsessed with knowledge, creating something that was beyond his control. I think it was more that and less of the like psychological thriller element. But it would have been fascinating to me nevertheless if that was the case. And speaking of the narrator, my second and last con with this book is the narrator himself. And the what I mean by this is that when reading this book, it's not always easy to get into the voice of the narrator. At least for me, it took some time. Like, even though I have read other like classic literature before, and I'm a bit used to the old English type of writing, it still took a bit to get into it. And do not mistake this for me saying that the writing is bad. No, the writing is actually beautiful. Like Mary Shelley, her command of the English language is very stunning, and I don't have words to describe it, but it's very pretty to read. It's very fancy, very articulate, and she uses very nice words out of the lexicon of the British English. And it's a very nice read, basically, if you enjoy those little like nice usage of words. But it doesn't mean that it's the easiest thing to read, because in our day-to-day life, we're not used to that English anymore, or at least depending on where you live, of course. But for that reason, it at times takes you out of the story, and you kind of have to read some things again and again to kind of figure out what a character was trying to say or present. So that is something that is a bit of that deserves a bit of my critique as well as to the Book of Frankenstein. But it's nothing that takes away from the story itself, and hence why, now diving outside of the pros and cons, I'd still heavily recommend you read this book, especially if you're someone who's just interested in science fiction in general. I think this is like a classic sci-fi read for everyone, and it's also just a classic piece of literature as well that is just worthwhile diving into if you have the time. It's not even that long. It's about 230 something pages long, depending on which edition you get. But it's a very quick read if you have the time, of course, to read it. I took a long time because I have a lot of other things going on in my life, but I still really enjoyed this book. And if you have the time to read, or if you have the dedication to read, I think it's something that you can literally get through in about like 4 evenings, I would say. Like, it's a very quick read, and it's very engrossing and interesting. So I definitely recommend you read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I give it a 4 out of 5 on Goodreads, and it was almost very close to getting a 5 out of 5 from in my book. But the only reason why it hasn't gotten a 5 out of 5 is because of those two little criticism that I gave it, and also just the star rating system is a very biased thing. So it was just my opinion, basically. But I really enjoyed this book, and I'd heavily recommend it to you if you're curious about this genre as well. Like the more sci-fi, contemplative type of fiction, and also a little bit of horror, basically. I hope you enjoyed this review, and I hope to see you guys very soon again. And bye.